Welcome to another episode of the brand called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm privileged to welcome for a second time a very senior and respected professor from Japan, Professor Yoichiro Sato. Professor Sato, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting.
Thank you. Professor Sato is the professor of the Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University in Japan. He's an expert in Japanese foreign and security policy, maritime affairs, US foreign policy, and strategy and international political economy. He has published more than 10 academic books and countless articles and book chapters in academic journals. And today we will talk about geopolitics and economics focused on Japan, India, with a reference to China. So, sir, let's talk first to geopolitics, India and Japan. It's a very, very strong relationship for a long time. How do you assess the evolving dynamics of the Japan India strategic partnership in the context of a rising China?
Yes, I think the rise of China is definitely a key driver of the kind of approaching or between India and Japan. But also probably equally important is the declining credibility of the U.S. commitment to the defense of Japan,
Correct.
as far as the Japanese side is concerned.
Yes.
And so, from the Japanese point of view, it's part of the overall hedging strategy. India is not going to replace the United States,
Yeah.
but the partnership with India will enhance Japan's utility to the collective security, which would hopefully anchor the U.S. commitment to the regional defense.
Well
But
said.
but this perspective is not necessarily shared by India, and I think we can talk more about this later. But
Correct.
that could pose a limit to the further growth of the India-Japan relationship.
Yes, yes. But so could Japan's pacifist constitution limits its ability to act as a counterbalance to China's military rise? How is China's growing presence in the Indian Ocean a concern for Japan?
Yeah, the first question, the Japan's interpretation of the constitution. As you might remember, late Prime Minister Abe in 2014 announced that his government would reinterpret the constitution. And the previous interpretation was that Japan's constitution was permitting self-defense, but not the collective self-defense, and which limited what Japan could do in the coalition operations, especially in regard to military roles in relation to combat missions. So the reinterpretation by the Abe administration relaxed this very strict interpretation and opened the path for limited collective defense, not only with the United States, but also with other partners who's working together for regional security, which is essential for Japan's own survival.
Very interesting.
Yeah, and you had the second part in the question.
Which is how is China's growing presence in the Indian Ocean a concern for Japan?
Yes. Indian Ocean has always been a major security interest for Japan because of Japan's extended trade routes into the Indian Ocean region. And two trades are particularly important. One is the energy import from the Middle East, Persian Gulf region, and this route goes through the Indian Ocean into the Strait of Hormuz and into the Persian Gulf. This is very important lifeline for Japanese economy. And the other sea lane goes through the Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Aden into the Red Sea, and then passing through Suez Canal into the Mediterranean to connect Japan with Europe as well as some North African countries which produce, again, important energy resources. So for both reasons, the Indian Ocean has been very important for Japan's security. But during the Cold War, partly because of the limited naval capacity of Japan, but also because of the restrictions on the collective defense, which I mentioned earlier, Japan pretty much consigned the role of the Indian Ocean security to the U.S. Navy. And the U.S. Navy was the sole provider of security in the Indian Ocean region. But this is changing as the Indian Ocean region has become a more competitive arena. And for Japan, bad news is that China is getting involved, and Japan itself is also playing a more active role in the Indian Ocean region since the turn of this century.
Correct.
Starting with the dispatch of the refueler into the Indian Ocean region in cooperation with allied navies against the Taliban and Al Qaeda in Afghanistan. And a good news is that India is developing its naval force, and India and Japan are closely working together to improve their respective capabilities.
Correct.
Through,
But
joint
you
exercise.
mentioned a few minutes back that you felt that Japan was very keen, but India did not seem to reciprocate. Please help me understand this a little more.
Yeah, I think that the Japan's call for India is based on Japan's own interest. Absolutely. That India plays a very important kind of supplementary role to the collective defense effort. And the Indian perspective is slightly different. I think India and Japan have a slightly different take on China. And although India talks about the maritime security of the Indian Ocean region and feel kind of alerted by the China's growing presence there. Primarily, China is India's land border neighbor.
Correct.
And with this land border, India has dealt with border disputes over the past 60 years.
Yeah.
And India has managed this relationship mostly diplomatically. I mean, of course, occasional clash of forces have happened, but none of which elevated into a full-scale warfare between the two countries. So India is somewhat confident about the relationship with China. And Japan, I think, doesn't have that kind of confidence, and the maritime disputes in East Asian seas is very intense right now,
Right.
and particularly in regard to Taiwan, the the flashpoint there is, it has a high chance that it might actually explode,
Correct.
and Japan has already announced that the security of Taiwan is a direct security concern
Correct.
for Japan.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that kind of perception gap between India and Japan reflects in how they see the presence in the Indian Ocean region.
Very
I think,
interesting.
yeah, I think
Very
India doesn't want to do too much to make China agitated more than necessary,
Mm.
whereas Japan wants to do more than
Correct.
India wants to do.
Correct. Correct. Absolutely. And I think I probably agree with your perspective. But moving on, Professor Sato, how important is technology and cybersecurity uh, in this entire strategic competition between the three countries?
Yeah. I think technology and cybersecurity domains are the areas where India and Japan can cooperate very closely without, really fearing the kind of rebuttal from China.
Hmm.
And that's because the war's already happening in those domains,
Hmm.
in the sense that some of the cyber attacks are originating in countries like Russia, China, or North Korea, and the because it's a gray zone kind of attacks on the U.S., Japan, India, EU countries, and so forth. So the preparation for that doesn't necessarily identify any particular threat as such. Threats can be even non-state actors.
Hmm.
So this kind of the abstract threat image is actually more conducive for a closer cooperation
Hmm.
between the India and Japan.
Hmm.
And technology field also, I think it's not only a defense issue, but it's also economic issue. And India has the growing the human talents in
Correct.
this area,
Hmm.
and the United States graduate schools in the engineering field are basically sustained by the Chinese and the Indian students,
Correct.
and without them, the U.S. technological leadership is not gonna continue.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
yeah, for Japan to cooperate with India is actually very much of a benefit to Japan. And currently, the U.S. is trying to delink China and Chinese corporations
Hmm.
from some of the high-tech production chain,
Absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
India is well positioned to take advantage of the divestment of Japanese companies
Hmm.
away from China, or U.S. companies
Hmm.
away from China,
Correct.
and start the production within the Indian territory,
Hmm.
and be a important link in the production chain of the sophisticated high-tech products.
Very true. Very true. I want to move now, Professor Sato, from geopolitics to economics. And I want to ask you, what opportunities does India present as an alternative supply chain hub to reduce dependency on China? Because China's invested very large sums of money in its supply chain over the years.
Right. I think India has a real expertise to step in and play a very important part of the restructuring of the supply chain. And the engineers who are getting PhDs in the U.S. graduate schools, they they can work in the U.S. company, or they can work in India, they can work in Japan, and this kind of human network among the top engineers and also the business leaders in the high-tech sectors going to grow more at the time when the Chinese companies are facing tougher, tariffs and export controls and other trade restricting, investment restricting measures by the United States. So I think India can step in, not only the commodity chips, for example, the divestment of commodity chip production from China to Southeast Asia and to India is already happening, and those are relatively low-tech kind of semiconductors.
Right.
But still, there is a global shortage of it because of the application of semiconductors into pretty much every single electronic product.
Correct.
Yeah. So there is an opportunity there, and also for more advanced chips, I think the divestment away from China and also reshoring some of the fabrications operations from Taiwan also is an opportunity for Indian companies to grab a part of the share of such productions.
Very interesting. But tell me, how do Japan's investments in India compare with its investments in China when it comes to strategic industries?
Japan's not investing much in the strategically most important industries in China.
Okay.
I think what Japan has transferred to China started with the labor-intensive kind of works.
Yes.
And then gradually shifted to, like somewhat more advanced production because of, the quality of Chinese laborers pretty consistent. But Japan kept the most technologically sophisticated productions at home and didn't move them into China. So in that sense, the high-tech China is actually indigenously developed, which is actually a reason the US is really alerted by this trend that China may not be dependent on the West or on Japan as much as we used to think.
Very interesting. So, but tell me, how do supply chain resilience initiatives by Japan and India align with US economic policies?
Japan is trying to cope with the US strategy. The US strategy is based on, home shoring, reshoring. So the Trump wants the US companies to produce as many things as possible within the US territory. And this works not only against China, but it could also work against Japan. And the degree to which Trump enforces this kind of reshoring is carefully observed by Japan, and Japan's trying to minimize and limit the reshoring to the narrow segment of products, and Taiwan's feeling the same way.
Correct.
And oftentimes, this kind of the government interventions are inconsistent with the market forces, and the Trump wants, the high tech production to take place in the U.S. Trump wants to reduce dependence on, the most sophisticated NVIDIA chip, coming from Taiwan
Yeah.
and so forth.
Yeah.
But the question is, why did the U.S. not have such production or have lost such production in the first place?
Absolutely.
And that's because of the various economic reasons,
True.
cost and quality reasons. And the TSMC, the president has already said quite clearly that the company doesn't intend to bring the most sophisticated 2 nanometer the chips production into the US factories.
True.
So
True.
they think they cannot produce the same quality in the US factory.
Well said. Well said. I have time for 2 or 3 more questions for you, sir.
Sure.
How is Japan navigating energy security challenges given China's dominance in critical minerals?
Yeah, that's a very important question. For a long time, for Japan, the energy issue was, about the petroleum and natural gas, mainly coming from the Middle East,
Correct.
and trying to diversify the supplies into Russia, for example. But I think the energy issue has become more complex in recent years. And I think the first complexity came from the way Japan dealt with the nuclear power plants. And, Japan was pretty much determined to increase the proportion of nuclear power in the overall energy portfolio until the 2011, the nuclear accident in Fukushima.
Correct.
And also the nuclear power plants have mostly reopened, and Japan continues to use nuclear power generations. Japan's more seriously looking into other types of renewable energy sources, and hydrogen is one of them, and also the solar power, another. But for many of those new energy issues, the batteries technology is critically important, and for battery, the rare earth material supply is very important.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
Japan has a technology to do that, but so far Japan has relied so much on the import of rare earth material from China. And this is the critical dependence of Japan.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. Could Japan and China and India jointly create some new digital economy standards as an alternative to China's model?
Yeah, I believe so. The standard setting is a very important part of competition in the economic domain.
Correct.
And this is found in many different sectors. Like, if you look at the history of the computer industry, the IBM basically set the standard, and everybody was following this, and also the Windows is another kind of standard setting
Absolutely.
example.
Yes.
And in I think in the information technology and data centers and all those batteries and alternative energies, standard setting is
Yes.
very important.
True.
And for the automobile, I think we are facing a kind of critical juncture,
Mm.
away from the fossil fuel
Mm.
powered automobiles.
Yeah.
But what's next is at the moment very unclear.
Mm.
China bet on electric
Correct.
power,
Correct.
like European countries
Yeah.
did to a large extent.
Mm.
But now this electric vehicle ideas is being revised, and what would be the next? Toyota is betting on
Hydrogen.
hydrogen,
Yes.
and there's some others like the hybrid used to be kind of identified as a transitional
Mm.
stage, between the fossil fuel and electric. But maybe hybrid model may have a longer lifespan
Right.
than initially expected.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely. And my last question for you, sir. As you look ahead, do you think demographic challenges in China and Japan may impact their engagement with India?
Yes, I think both China and Japan are having really skewed demographic
Correct.
distribution,
Yes.
and the aging of the society has come to both countries.
Absolutely.
And whereas India still has a large
Young.
population and relatively high birth rate as
Mm.
well.
Mm.
So, so the population overall is young, and this will the India will offer uh, a great market for both countries, China and Japan, and also a potential source of laborers.
Mm.
And so, in those economic domains, I think you know Japan will try to cooperate with India.
Mm.
I'm not sure about China,
Yeah.
but between Japan and India, this is already happening quietly
Mm.
because of the India and Japan don't have the large scale the worker
Mm.
import agreement,
Mm.
but Japan has a scheme like that with Nepal,
Mm.
and in the name of trainees, Nepali workers can come to Japan
Mm.
under special visa,
Mm.
and they can work in various Japanese occupations.
Correct. Correct.
But with India, already the number of students coming to study in Japan's
Mm.
up, and those students in Japan, they are allowed to work up to 28 hours per week,
Mhm.
and many of them do have those part-time employment. And during the break, summer recess, winter recess,
Mm.
they can work up to 48 hours
Yeah.
per week.
Mm.
That's full time.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. So
Absolutely.
those schemes have become a sort of a informal path
Mm.
for students who wants to work and make some money in Japan.
Very interesting. Very interesting. But on that note, Professor Sato, every time I speak to you, I wish I could keep speaking to you more to just keep learning from the incredible amount of knowledge you have. Thank you today for speaking to me about India, China, and Japan. Thank you also for speaking to me about both geopolitical aspects and economic aspects. Thank you, sir, again for speaking to me, and all the best to you.
Thank you very much. Good to see you again.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.